Now that Etheria Restart has been out for a few months, most players have already figured out how to clear endgame content and, more importantly, what the fastest/strongest teams will look like. In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into Terrormaton at the highest difficulty levels, from Hell 3 all the way to Inferno. We'll break down which teams you should be bringing, how to build around certain animuses, and everything else you need to know to clear these stages. If you found this video helpful or learned something new though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you again to Etheria Restart for sponsoring today's video. Enough stalling though, let's get into it. Before we get into the teams themselves, there are a few important things to keep in mind. There's quite a bit of variety when it comes to what units you can use to clear Terrormaton, and most of the fastest and most consistent Inferno clears tend to rely on characters like Lily and Shadow Sonya, who are Disorder and Constant types. This is worth noting since Disorder and Constant types are much more difficult to obtain in theory. That said, there are players who already have cleared this content even without them, so this guide isn't meant to tell you it's impossible to clear this without these units, but instead it's here to fill in the gaps for players who are struggling with Inferno or those who are preparing to take on these stages soon. To add to this, if you're someone who's just getting started with the game, there's no real reason to rush into Inferno. The content is built for experienced teams, and you'll have a much better time if you progress naturally rather than try to brute force your way through endgame content before you're ready. Next, we need to talk about the best one-shot team and why searching for something like this / thinking in best one-shot sort of thinking can be kind of dangerous. Let's start by talking about the fastest clears though for Terrormaton. The lineup of Shadow Sonya, Fengus, Kachi, RC77, and Yang takes the title of quickest kill, but despite this, there are some concerning aspects to this clear. For instance, despite being a dot-focused team of Shadow Sonya and multi-hitters, you could question whether or not this was a super lucky / RNG run, as these characters do not deal an insane amount of damage themselves outside of Sonya or provide insane buffs that we are unaware of. Additionally, although we have no footage to verify exactly what happened here, it's likely that the initial hits from Yang, RC77, and Kachi activated Fengus's skill 2 passive to then apply even more damage over time effects, which would make this an extremely lucky clear. Outside of this, the concept for the team does make sense in theory, despite us not actually having access to the run, but with this, Yang in theory again would begin by starting the fight by stripping the boss of his turn 1 immunity. Fengus would then use his skill 3 and apply his damage over time effect and slow debuff. Shadow Sonya would then extend the duration of all debuffs using her skill 2. RC77 would then apply another round of debuffs with his skill 3 and attack plus defense reduction, and finally Kachi would take the turn, push back the enemy using his skill 3, and potentially apply more debuffs through Fengus's skill 2 passive. Now, as a final note on this run or team in general, there's a decent chance that any Sonya based team is manually controlled, and as a result, this 23-second run could have also been changed in different ways. To explain, Sonya may have used her skill 1 at the start of battle to apply more dot effects, and to give another example, Kachi may not push up Sonya if used on auto after his first turn, and these are pretty significant changes to the run regardless of RNG. So if you're looking for a full auto RNG-less run, this is probably not the team for you. When we move to the second fastest team of Yeli, Beyontin, Heinrich, Dorothy, and Freya, the way this team clears is much more straightforward. Based on the lineup gathered, this is more defense break and one-shot leaning, with Yeli being the clear focus of the team. In this scenario, Heinrich would start the fight by removing the immunity once again and apply his crit buff, but following this, Freya would apply a team-wide attack increase while also pushing back the enemy / debuffing them with Nightmare, which of course increases damage taken. From here, Dorothy the Wisher applies her crit rate buff to the team, Beyontin provides a multi-man crit damage increase, and finally Yeli uses her skill 3 to provide buffs to herself while also defense breaking and potentially one-shotting the enemy at the same time. Now conceptually again, this team appears to make sense. There's a defense break, you buff the team a significant amount, and then Yeli obliterates said boss. However, the issue with seeing a lineup like this and considering it the best potential team is that, like the last team, this could be extremely RNG / lucky. Yeli could have performed her follow-up tech 3, 4, heck, even 100 times in a row if she was that lucky, but for transparency's sake and as a disclaimer, I by no means am saying that these teams are bad or not viable. However, them being at the top of the clear time chart should not make you automatically believe that they are 100% consistent and have 0% fail rates. To their credit though, if the team had less RNG characters as their main source of damage, this team would seem more consistent. However, this isn't the case, and as a result, I would be careful when following or trying to replicate lineups that do have RNG based characters. Now, although I caution following teams without doing any research yourself, I do have recommendations for teams that you could use to minimize some of the RNG. As a reminder though, most teams in Etheria are categorized into two groups: teams that are RNG heavy but clear in under a minute / very quickly, and teams that have 0 RNG but clear in anywhere between 2 and 10 minutes. With this, one of the best and most consistent teams includes, you guessed it, Shadow Sonya, Fengus, Valerian, Holden, and everyone's favorite, Lily. Of course guys, the light and dark characters are always going to be the strongest, and that's just the way that the game is designed. I apologize. However, this is a very powerful and consistent team, and as a result, the core strategy focuses on Holden dispelling immunity so that Shadow Sonya and Fangus can apply damage over time effects until the boss is defeated, and with this, the ideal turn order is Lily first, followed by Holden, then Shadow Sonya or Fangus, with Valerian taking the final turn. Speed tuning wise, Lily should be the fastest at around 270 to 280 plus speed, Holden can stay around 260 to 270 speed, and finally, while both Shadow Sonya and Fangus can range between 200 to 240 speed, the main goal here is just to make sure that Shadow Sonya doesn't get pushed up and outspeeds Holden's skill 3 Dispel. Now, regarding other stats and build, it is important to note that in this lineup, many of these characters will prefer stacking as much effect accuracy as possible, and with this, Swift Rush should be prioritized on basically all characters to maximize their speed and overall stat efficiency, with the exception of Valerian. Now, in terms of lattice investment, Shadow Sonya may clear in some cases even without her skill 1 max, but the difference between a Sonya with or without this is absolutely game-changing. Fangus, on the other hand, gains decent value when maxed, but he can get away with just his skill 2 and skill 3 fully upgraded. Valerian, on the other hand, really only needs skill 3 maxed, as this will allow her to buff the entire team and prevent anyone from dying turn 1. Lily ideally has her skill 1 maxed for increased dual attack consistency, while Holden can max his skill 3 too if he's aiming to increase his chances of stripping. Now, moving further into build and even shell, these two can vary significantly once again. Most characters will end up using something like Swift Rush, with again the exception of Valerian, but some characters will actually end up using Bloodbath, or even sets like Unbreakable, Bramble, or Time Weaver. This prevents allies from dying too quickly or reduces the cooldown of Animus skills, which can be extremely clutch, but as always, relying on something RNG like Time Weaver can ultimately feel more frustrating or misleading if it's the only reason that you clear the fight. For Valerian specifically though, using Time Weaver just to have the chance of proccing this Animus cooldown reduction is still ideal, however, even if she can't use the effect chance, but otherwise, using the added defense / other survivability sets can help, but isn't nearly as impactful. For her other module sets though, she ideally uses Wellspring and later will end up using Evil Guard as her third set, but now it's time we talk about the different shells that most characters can use. Now again, this will definitely vary depending on what's available or how you plan on running these teams, but put simply, Codex of Magic, Jackal Guard, Gigabyte, or even Artisan are usable for most characters in this lineup. Each shell has their own distinct advantage, and that includes things like turn meter increases, a barrier to prevent one of your low health allies from dying, or even the ability to use a powerful skill tree twice. To give a quick set of sample stats and build, however, Lily will be 300 speed and have defensive main stats on her 3 right side modules, and her sets will include 12-piece Swift Rush, a flexible non-Swift Rush Matrix set, and her shell will be Artisan. Shadow Sonya will be 210 speed with 26,000 health and 200 effect accuracy, and her sets will include Swift Rush plus Time Weaver, with their shell being Codex of Magic. Holden will also be 270 speed with 22,000 plus HP and 200 effect accuracy, but with this, his set will include Swift Rush plus Time Weaver. But in regards to Fangus, he will be 240 speed with 22,000 HP and have 200 effect accuracy, just like Holden. Similar to him as well, his matrices will include Swift Rush plus Time Weaver with Artisan as his shell, matching Holden for a final time. Finally though, Valerian ideally will have 36,000 HP and hopefully not too many speed substats, but for sets, she will have 12-piece Wellspring and once again a flexible matrix set of your choosing that adds defensive stats. Shell-wise though, she'll definitely have Gigabyte. To be clear, this team is still affected by RNG, as failing to apply damage over time effects or missing the strip on Holden's skill 3 does obviously impact the run negatively. However, based on the character's rate of failure and the clear speed typically staying under 2 minutes, this is one of the strongest teams for good reason. Now of course, this does have 2 light and dark units, and as someone who didn't have access to Lily until much later, I feel your pain if this doesn't help you whatsoever. As a result, one of the other teams I found to be quite strong is Kachi the Guard, Valerian, and a combination of 3 final picks. Depending on who you have access to, these characters can vary between Fangus, Dieting, Holden, Mia, Fuchu, or even Kazumi Kazuyo. However, what's important here is the role that these characters play. Kachi provides a decent amount of survivability through his defense and immunity buffs, and Valerian heals, applies invulnerability, and prevents an ally from dying every time that she uses her skill 3 or at the start of battle. Now regarding the other characters' roles, Fangus, Dieting, Holden, Mia Fuchu, and Kazumi Kazuyo are all useful for different reasons. Some will offer survivability / healing, some will offer damage, or they will strip the boss of his immunity, and in truth, the exact combination of which of these characters you'll use is very subjective. As a result, my best recommendation is to take a DPS like Fangus or Dieting, then include more healers if you're in danger of getting one-shot by the boss, and otherwise, if you find yourself needing faster clears at potentially risk of failure, taking additional strippers or more aggressive supports can be fine too. Lattice-wise, many of these characters still prefer maxing effect chance-based upgrades like Kachi's skill 3, but to give a quick rundown, Fangus prefers all skills maxed as previously mentioned. However, However, once again, he can survive with just his skill 2 and skill 3 upgraded. Dieting prefers all but the last level of his skill 1 max, as this does increase his damage. Holden also prefers increasing the effect chance of his skill 3, but since golden lattices are more rare, this is much less realistic for the average player. Mia ideally upgrades her skill 2 to increase the chance of dispelling buffs, but to her credit, you could put points into her skill 3 or skill 1 if survivability is a concern. And similarly, Fuchu works with minimal investment into her kit, but increasing the turn meter effect, shield amounts, or even chance to trigger Moonlit Veil on skill 2 can be decent too. Kazumi does prefer having skill 3 and skill 2 maxed, however, as this decrease in cooldown, increase in buff duration, and chance to debuff does improve her impact by a significant amount, especially with all the anime skill cooldown reduction from shells, kits, sets, etc. Finally, Valerian does prefer just her skill 3 maxed, but she does gain value from leveling her skill 2. And regarding Catchy the Guard, maxing his skill 3 and skill 2 is also a must. Build-wise though, these characters can once again differ in terms of setup or stat line, so rather than sit here and list out every possible set combination, here is once again a quick potential set of sample stat lines and builds, with tuning and adjustments definitely needed depending on your team. Dieting will have 3800 attack, 100 crit rate, and 300 crit damage, and his sets will include 12-piece momentum plus 8-piece fury, with his shell being White Fang. Kazumi Kazuya will be 220 speed with 28,000 HP and 200 effect accuracy, and her sets will include Swift Rush plus Time Weave, with her shell being Gigabyte or Jackal Guard. Catchy the Guard will be 240 speed with 26,000 HP and 200 effect accuracy, and his set will include Swift Rush plus Time Weave, but finally for shell, he will take Artisan. Now for Valerian, she will once again need at least 36,000 HP, but for sets, she will ideally have 12-piece Wellspring, and again, a flexible matrix set of your choosing that adds defensive stats. Shell-wise though, she'll still keep Gigabyte here. Now there is always the argument of whether health 3/4 is better than farming for Inferno, but admittedly, there are really only two arguments to either side of this discussion. To start, having the extra stats from a 6-piece set like Swift Smite will automatically make Inferno extremely worthwhile if you need to outspeed an opponent in content like PvP. However, as I'm sure you guys can tell, clearing or beating Inferno is no easy task. As a result, if you're in a position where PvP is a higher priority for you, it's clear that the need for speed will unironically push you to need to clear Inferno. That said, as certain team compositions don't even need a third set in some cases, like with Shadow Sonya, and as a result, doing early farming of health 3/health 4 instead of pushing for Inferno can actually be worth it. With this, later returning back to try and clear Inferno after having some gear is actually a decent idea, admittedly. To sum it all up though, clearing Terrormaton, especially on Inferno, comes down to having a well-built team, proper speed tuning, and a solid understanding of your Animus roles. While flashy one-shot comps like Yeli or certain Shadow Sonya teams might top the leaderboards, they often come with heavy RNG and gear checks. For most players, consistent teams like the Lily, Hold, and Fangus core offer far more stability and reliability, especially when paired with proper lattice investment and optimized module setups. If you're not ready for Inferno though, health 3 and health 4 remain great farming options until your gear and units are up to speed, but whether you're chasing clears or farming efficiently, focus on what your account is able to do and the results will follow. Thanks again for watching though guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks again to Etheria Restart for sponsoring today's video though, but as always though guys, stay safe, stay healthy, good night.